As we know, religious freedom is a predictor of conflict, extremism, and stability. And Afghanistan is a great example of a country where religion, governance, and security are inseparable, and how the collapse of religious freedom can serve as an early warning sign and indicator of conflict and instability within a nation. And so, examining Afghanistan through this lens of religious freedom shows why religious freedom is not just a moral concern, but a strategic factor in US diplomacy and global security. Religion has never been separate from political authority in Afghanistan's history. Since the 19th century, every Afghan government has used Islam as a tool to govern, not just as a private belief system. Early leaders like Emir Abdurrahman transformed Islam into a mechanism of state control through religious law being used to unify diverse regions, political authority being justified through religious legitimacy, codifying Islamic law as supreme law, and replacing a number of local customs with religious norms. And so the conflict in Afghanistan is not a matter of religious versus secular. It's about how different leaders have deployed Islam as a political tool. And so the modern nation state context has transformed religion into a resource for power, not just a personal belief system. And the Taliban today continue this pattern. They use religion as a mechanism for state control. Security policy, legal norms, and social behavior are all enforced through a religious context. Examples of this are restricting women's education and glorifying violence under religious rhetoric. And so religious freedom in Afghanistan has arguably, but very widely collapsed. And the Taliban have eradicated meaningful religious freedom from society at large. And all Afghans, especially women, minorities, and religious dissenters, face persecution. And so Afghanistan illustrates how the erosion of religious freedom and the overentanglement of religion with political authority creates a direct threat to human rights. It fuels national instability and extremism, and it definitely complicates US diplomatic engagement across the broader Middle East. And so reestablishing peace and sustainable political order requires a culturally informed recalibration of the relationship between religion and state policy, as well as credible strategies to curb extremist government and limit the Taliban's coercive control. So how does religious freedom sit at the center of global human rights framework? We know that religious freedom is a foundational human right as it's enshrined in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Religion enables freedom of expression, equality before the law, assembly and participation in public life. And so religion itself, we know, is not inherently violent. The outcomes of religious expression depend on leadership, interpretation, and the political context. And so when religious freedom is eroded, other rights quickly follow in this erosion, and systems of repression can expand. And we see this in Afghanistan because religious freedom is not treated as an isolated right. It's marginalized women, ethnic minorities, and religious communities, and systematic violence and discrimination has spread across Afghan society. And so restrictions related to religion have occurred that have affected human rights, such as arbitrary arrests, torture, enforcement disappearances, executions and killings. And so freedom of thought, conscience, and religion are foundational rights that enable other basic freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, equality before the law. And Afghanistan's recent trajectory under the Taliban demonstrates that when religious freedom is eradicated, it undermines nearly every other right that policymakers value. So why does religious restriction correlate with instability, extremism, and violence? In much of the Middle East, national identity remains closely tied to religion. And Afghanistan shows the fallacy that religion declines with modernization, which is an assumption that US policymakers have long held. The conflict in Afghanistan stems from how political and religious authority have been ineffectively integrated over time, and how the state has chosen to align or unalign with specific religious factions and oppress religious actors. The Taliban government has emerged from a prolonged civil war. Uh, this comes from ethno-religious competition, power struggles, Western efforts and failures to deploy modernization and end conflict. And the West has tried to step in and minimize this conflict in Afghanistan by introducing secular ideologies like Marxism and communism, but these have failed. And religion has remained embedded in social networks and legitimacy in Afghanistan despite these failures and despite these efforts over time. And so we've seen that when religious expression has been blocked, civil conflict has intensified. And the argument here is that low religious freedom leads to radicalization, displacement, and violence, because religious freedom functions as a diagnostic indicator of rights erosion, and it's a geopolitical variable that shapes legitimacy, conflict, and diplomatic risk. How does the US evaluate religious freedom, and why does their evaluation matter? US foreign policy has long assumed that religion would decline with modernization, but this assumption has proven to be false. Religion increasingly shapes political identity and behavior across the globe, and US policy often misreads religion's role in non-Western societies. And the over-reliance on European secularization models and ignoring the effects that religious freedom has had on Afghanistan has been detrimental. The consequences of this have included the ineffective use of big military, such as after 9/11, ineffective policy responses and failed diplomatic efforts, and of course, the lack of diplomatic relationship built on trust and understanding between the US and Afghanistan. And so religion remains a key determinant of stability. And Afghanistan is still strategically relevant for the US. It's a concern for US foreign policy, even after the US military has withdrawn, because it continues to affect core American interests in security, regional stability, humanitarian outcomes, and global terrorism. And it's become a haven for extremist groups because of the lack of religious freedom there, including ISKP and remnants of Al-Qaeda, which pose ongoing threats beyond Afghanistan's borders and still mark a priority for US counterterrorism efforts. And so religious freedom is not symbolic or secondary. It actively shapes operational decisions. How has promoting religious freedom supported or complicated US diplomacy? We know that conflict is rooted in the fact that basic human needs and rights are being unmet and neglected by the government in Afghanistan. And the US separation of church and state has sometimes limited our understanding of how to approach effective diplomacy. The failure to engage religion has weakened policy effectiveness. And the risks of this engagement in Afghanistan are ideologically rigid Taliban governance, persistent terrorist violence, limited international recognition, weak diplomatic leverage. And so there's a balance that's required here. Ignoring religion worsens outcomes, and weaponizing religion undermines credibility. And so, because we know that in Afghanistan, religious identity takes precedence over political ideology, effective diplomacy will require respect for Afghanistan's culture and religious identity, and avoiding imposed universalism or biased assumptions. So the recommendation here is implementing targeted sanctions and accountability measures within Afghanistan, routing humanitarian aid through independent partners, expanding refugee protection pathways, treating religious freedom as a red line in negotiations and a non-negotiable condition for diplomatic engagement. Afghanistan requires diplomacy that understands religion rather than ignores it. And so religious freedom should be treated as a strategic early warning indicator, not an afterthought.